Well, good afternoon, everyone. Although it's not a spring-like day like we've enjoyed or we thought would be continuous after the first few days of warm weather, I think we're back to reality today. In honor of Black History Month, I thank you for joining us for the 6th annual Lanae Ashley Moore Forum. It begins with each of us, fostering racial understanding. The theme for this year's forum is a way forward. Welcome to our virtual Zoom audience, and welcome to everyone joining with us in person today. My name is Lonnie Moore III, and I am your Master of Ceremony for today's program. I also serve as Vice President of Marketing for the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, and I'm a 7th generation direct descendant of the Perkins Dennis family. I am pleased to have with me today my lovely wife, Shantae, sitting over there. My son, Lonnie Moore IV, who just walked in. Hello, son. And his lovely girlfriend, Kayla. Hi, Kayla. Today's forum is named after my late daughter, Lanae Ashley Moore. And Lanae was a lovely and precious young lady who attended our very first forum, which was held at Keystone College in 2018. A few weeks following that forum, she tragically lost her life from injuries that she sustained due to an automobile accident, which is just really 6 days shy of her 21st birthday. Lanae attended Delaware State University at the time. She was a criminal justice major. She enthusiastically worked closely with the president, Denise Dennis, as an intern for the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust. After her passing, we decided that we would dedicate future forums in her name. You'll find a biography of Lanae inside of your. She will be forever cherished. I would like to send a special welcome to any high school and college students who are in attendance today. I know that we have Rosemont College over here. Give a shout, Rosemont. We're also pleased to have all of our students here today, whether you have come as a group or if you're joining individually or virtually. Before we get started, please make sure all cell phones are silent, on vibrate mode. And now it is my honor to introduce to you the Chief Operating Officer of the Museum of the American Revolution and our valued friend and partner for this important forum. Please welcome Zeanne Mason.
Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the board and staff of the Museum of the American Revolution. And it's always such a joy to have our good friends from the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust with us here today, our distinguished panel. Thank you for being with us. Denise was an early adapter to the promise of the Museum of the American Revolution. She called me out of the blue one day in 2015 and told me about her family history in the farm, which I was not familiar with. She saw the promise of a place that was going to uncover and share stories about the complex events and diverse people that sparked America's ongoing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. And we've had a lovely time these past 7 years, marking major occasions together. This is the 4th time we've had the honor of having this forum here as we remember Lanae. Just 2 weeks ago, we were together opening our new special exhibit called Black Founders, the Fortin Family of Philadelphia. And on your on your table, there's a piece of paper that has a listing on the back of some of the programs that are coming up in the coming months that you might want to enjoy. This is James Fortin is a name everyone should know and too few people don't. It's our great hope that by the time the show closes in November of this year, everyone will in fact know his name. And we're making strides in that regard. We can now call it critically acclaimed because we've had some wonderful national coverage, and Alex McKechnie, our incredible communications director, just sent me tomorrow's edition of the Philadelphia Sunday Sun with what does it say? The phenomenal James Fortin on the front, and he was phenomenal. He was a sailor who served in the Rev War. He was an incredibly successful businessman, civic leader, and abolitionist. And his story and that of three of his subsequent generations is told in a special exhibit down on our first floor that you're all invited to go and see today. So when you leave here, there's a little pin that you can get that will allow you access to not only that, but the second floor exhibit space. And I hope you'll have a chance to do that. So again, thank you so much for being with us. It's an honor to be a part of this forum, and turn things back to you, Alani.
Thank you, Zian. Since most of you aren't familiar with the Dennis Farm and what we do as the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, we have a short video to share with you. But first, I have just a few announcements to make. You will find a survey, I believe is the survey, in your folders. We would actually appreciate it if you would complete that survey at the end of the program and place it on your tables before you leave. If you are watching virtually, you will receive an email with this information. Also, students who plan to participate in the video contest will find contest guidelines in their form folder. Please read them carefully. Those of you who have joined us virtually, you will find the contest rules by visiting our web address at www.thedennisfarm.org. We will announce the first, second, and third place winners shortly after the March 3rd deadline to submit. So with that, I encourage you to pay close attention, take notes, and ask questions. At the end of today's forum, you will have an opportunity to take a tour of the museum provided by some of the staff members here at the museum. And before we get into the meat of the program, I know some of you who came in or some are just coming in right now, but traditionally what we like to do in the spirit of understanding is and of bringing people together, I would ask you to stand and take a few minutes just to greet somebody who you may not have ever thought of greeting before, and just introduce yourself. If you're joining virtually, we just ask that you give a shout out in the chat and let us know your name and where you are from. So just take about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll get into the meat of the program. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats. Please take your seats. Adrian. I did. Please take your seats, everyone. You can hear. Please take your seats, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Now we invite you to take a tour of the Dennis Farm.
Welcome to the historic Dennis Farm in the beautiful
Welcome to the historic Dennis Farm in the beautiful Endless Mountains of Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. This is the farm's lower plateau, overlooking Martins Creek. But the saga of this land and the people who lived here begins beyond these stone walls, uphill. So let's follow the farm's road uphill through a grove of hemlock trees. It passes through an open field to the top of the hillside where you'll see a monument that bears the names of those who first lived and died on the farm, and who are now resting in the Perkins Dennis Cemetery next to the monument. The family of Prince and Judith Perkins, free African Americans, came to the region from Connecticut in 1793 when George Washington was president and first settled the farm. Their original house was several feet downhill from the cemetery near a spring. All that remains of their house today is the stone foundation. However, a recent Binghamton University archaeological excavation revealed a great deal about the Perkinsons' daily lives. This field in autumn was a part of the Perkins homestead. During the American Revolution, Prince Perkins was a soldier in the 2nd Regiment of the Connecticut Line in the Continental Army for the town of Norwich. In 1792, he received the sum of 25 pounds, 6 shillings, and 4 pence lawful money for his service in the American Revolution. And in 1793, Prince Perkins made his first land purchase in Pennsylvania's Tunkhannock Township for 6 pounds. He sold that land and subsequently purchased the farm above Martins Creek. 2 local history books describe Prince Perkins as the fiddler for the community's festifications. One author cites this note: 1800, Prince Perkins, 11 shillings, 3 pence for fiddling on the 4th of July. Settlements in the Endless Mountains, inland and far from the coasts were, like upstate New York, the new nation's first frontier. The region was called a howling wilderness for the sound of wolves that echoed through the night. Prince Perkins' daughter, Phoebe, was married to a Revolutionary War veteran, another free African American from Connecticut named Bristol Bud Sampson, who also served in the 2nd Regiment of the Connecticut Line. Bristol Bud and Phoebe lived with the Perkins family until, after Bristol Bud applied for and received a pension that had become available to disabled vets of the Revolution, he and Phoebe purchased their own land next to the Perkins place. Both Prince Perkins and Bristol Bud Sampson, who now rest for all eternity in the Perkins Dennis Cemetery, are listed in the database at Valley Forge as Prince Negro and Bristol Bud, among the Connecticut regiments who served at Valley Forge the fateful winter of 1777. In 1818, the year Bristol Bud Sampson applied for his Revolutionary War pension, another free African American family moved to the mountains of Susquehanna County from New England. The family of James and Hannah Benson Dennis arrived in Auburn Township, Susquehanna County from Vermont in 1818, and their history is fascinating. James and Hannah Dennis were originally from Massachusetts. Hannah's grandparents, Nero and Dido Dingo Benson, were married in Framingham, Massachusetts in 1721. Her parents, Frank and Rosanna Lewis Benson, were married in Concord, Massachusetts in 1777, and Hannah was born in Concord in 1779. In 1804, James Dennis and Hannah Benson were married in Concord by Justice of the Peace A.B.L. Hayward, a Harvard alumnus. Their great-great-great-granddaughter, Denise Dennis, is pictured standing at A.B.L. Hayward's office doorway in 2012. By 1810, James and Hannah Benson Dennis were living on a farm in Chester, Vermont, where their fifth child, their youngest son, Henry W. Dennis, was born. This is a page from the war record of James Dennis, who was recruited by Vermont Lieutenant Thaddeus Stevens and served as a teamster in the War of 1812 before moving to Auburn Township in Susquehanna County with his family in 1818. The 1820 census for Susquehanna County, written in the vernacular of the day, lists colored residents as an addendum, noting that they are all free people. Among the 6 African American men who are heads of household are James Dennis in Auburn Township and Prince Perkins in Waterford Township, which was later renamed Brooklyn Township. 31 years later, these two families would be joined in marriage. When Prince Perkins passed away in 1839, at age 89, his son William Perkins inherited the property. That year, William Perkins entered into an agreement with Henry Dennis, who owned a farm in Dimock, Pennsylvania, through which Dennis borrowed a Perkins heifer for breeding for a period of 3 years. William and his wife Melinda had only one child who survived into adulthood, a daughter named Angeline, who would inherit the Perkins land one day. On April 24, 1851, 168 years ago, Henry W. Dennis married Angeline Perkins on the farm, and it was noted in a local newspaper. William Perkins passed away in 1858, 2 years before Abraham Lincoln was elected president, 3 years before the Civil War began, and 5 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, leaving the property to his wife and daughter, Angeline Perkins Dennis. Henry Dennis then sold his and his father's farm, and with the proceeds purchased a 100-acre farm with a house, built circa 1825, on the lower plateau adjoining the 70-acre Perkins farm. Since then, Henry and Angeline's combined properties have been known as the Dennis Farm. Henry and Angeline now rest in the Perkins-Dennis Cemetery at the hilltop. The Perkins-Dennis family accomplished all of this during a shameful period in American history when the enslavement of black people was legal. Nonetheless, the family prevailed. Henry and Angeline Dennis's youngest son, Sumner B. Dennis, was named in honor of the United States Senator from Massachusetts who fought for the civil rights of African Americans, Charles Sumner. All 21st century members of the Perkins-Dennis family are descendants of Sumner Dennis, pictured at the monument in 2014.
It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our president, CEO, and co-founder of the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust. She has been a driving force since she co-founded it in 2001. She's my first who I've had the great fortune of knowing all of my life. And now it is my honor to introduce her to you at this time, Miss Denise Dennis.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I've seen that video. To tell you the truth, I wrote the script, but it still makes me cry. So I'm embarrassed. It's quite something. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. Thank you, Lon dear, for that thoughtful, heartfelt introduction. I appreciate it. And thanks also to my friend, Zian Mason, and extended thank you to Scott and the fantastic staff of the Museum of the American Revolution. You know that this museum holds a very special place in my heart. And last but not least, I want to thank our stellar panel and moderator, Erin Haynes, Jesse McCarthy, and I promised I wouldn't do this, but full disclosure, Jesse's mother is one of my dearest friends, and she's watching from Paris, so hi, Elaine. And of course, our brilliant moderator, Adrian Whaley. I need a tissue. That video just really moved me for me. I need a tissue of somebody. Thank you, Chante. Thank you. It's the first time this has ever happened. Neither the museum nor the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust are political organizations, and we do not take sides politically. We are organizations that advance a more honest and complete history of the events and people who created this great nation, the world's most successful experiment in democracy thus far. Today, we, the people, are facing challenges to history and to intellectual freedom itself. Educators from elementary schools to universities, school boards, libraries, and librarians are under attack for teaching the truth, for teaching a more accurate and inclusive history of the United States. Even books by authors like Nobel laureate Toni Morrison are being banned. It is absolutely Orwellian. And with the suppression of truth, we are seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism, of attacks on Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, Latino Americans, women, and African Americans in voting rights. An attack on any one group of people is an attack on every one person. It is an attack on all of us and threatens our democracy. Rather than weep and moan over the attacks on facts and truth, this forum seeks to find positive solutions. How, though, can we teach historical truth in the face of intimidation and denial? You can see on the screen the title page of a book, Appeal, by David Walker, published in Boston in 1829. Walker was an African-American man born free in North Carolina in the 1790s, but he witnessed the horrors of slavery. He later moved to Philadelphia and to Boston. And in Boston, he wrote his appeal, a series of essays to African Americans, 90% of whom were enslaved, reminding them that they were Americans and entitled to the rights of all Americans, and that they must fight for them. He distributed his book by giving copies to Black sailors on ships in Boston Harbor who traveled to ports along the Atlantic coast and dispersed the books among the population there. Those who could read the book to enslaved illiterate African Americans. Walker was so successful in distributing the book and his ideas and sharing the truth with them that the South put a price on his head, offering $2,000 in 1829 money to anyone who would assassinate him, and $10,000 to anyone who would kidnap him and deliver him to the South so they could deal with him as they wished. Walker died in Boston in 1830, but he found a way to tell and share the truth. Frederick Douglass was only 11 years old when the appeal was published, but the book later influenced Douglass and other abolitionists who led the struggle for freedom. You'll recognize this photo, and if you haven't read Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant, I urge you to read it. Grant was, of course, the triumphant general of the Union Army during the Civil War and later president of the United States, a brilliant military strategist and the savior with Lincoln of the Union. By the year 1900, Grant was held in as high esteem as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. During Reconstruction, when he was president, he also fought for the rights of Black people, of the newly freed Black people in the South. Like Lincoln, Grant understood that without the right to vote, without the franchise, African Americans were at risk. He even sent troops into the South to go after probably the first American terrorist group, better known as the Ku Klux Klan. By the year 2000, though, the significance of Grant's role in American history was obscured. This was not by accident. Following the war and in the 20th century, the Daughters of the Confederacy made a well-organized effort to diminish, if not fully erase, Grant's achievement while glorifying Confederate generals like Lee. Books that told the truth about the war were systematically removed from schools and libraries throughout the South. Indeed, they changed the entire narrative about the Civil War, claiming that the South didn't fight to maintain slavery, but for a noble, lost cause. Grant led and won the fight to preserve the United States. Lee fought to destroy it. But the narrative was changed, just as there are attempts to change and obscure historical truth today. But as Ron Chernow's book shows, truth is persistent if we have the courage to fight for it and look for it. Next slide. You saw this in the video about the farm. It is a photo of Private Bristol Bud Sampson's Revolutionary War pension claim. Bristol Bud Sampson was an African-American man, the husband, Lonnie, of our great aunt Phoebe Perkins Sampson, and he is buried on the Dennis farm. If Bristol Sampson hadn't applied for and received his pension, we would have no record of his service from 1777 to 1783 in the American Revolution. And I have it up here today because he represents many African Americans who served in integrated regiments in the Revolution, whose service is only recently being uncovered and acknowledged. Why was the service of African Americans in the Revolution omitted from the official history for so long? And this museum has worked hard to correct that centuries-old error. But why was that? Why did that happen? Because it is easier to excuse and perpetuate racial discrimination if the truth remains hidden. Now the full history of African Americans in American history is being told. And now that that's happening, there are forces afoot to suppress and erase it. But we're not going to let that happen. The attempts to suppress the truth will ultimately fail, but only if each of us does our part. Knowledge is power. Every year at this forum, I ask everyone, present and virtual, to be ambassadors for fostering understanding across lines of race, religion, ethnicity, culture, and nationality. We are all in this together on this very small blue planet. Hopefully, this forum will give you more tools in your toolbox for fostering understanding in your lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Denise. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's panel discussion, Adrienne G. Whaling. She is an educator and history lover who currently serves as Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Museum of the American Revolution. She was recently named a class of 2022 40 under 40 by the Philadelphia Business Journal and a 10 under 40 People to Watch honoree by the Philadelphia Tribune. Adrienne earned her bachelor's degree in African American Studies from Harvard University and her master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania. She has worked she has worked in both art and history museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. Adrienne loves the potential for objects, artifacts, and primary source documents to enrich student learning experiences. She carries her love of history and for uncovering the stories of common people into her spare time as an avid genealogist, researching her own family history, and as a programming chair and former president of Philadelphia's African American Genealogy Group. As both a museum educator and as a genealogist, she has presented on television and in workshops and conferences, both locally and nationally. Please welcome Adrienne.
I should have given them the shorter version of my bio. Basically, Adrienne is a nerd who loves history. And I'm very excited that I get to be in a room with other people who love history and who understand the potential impact of learning and deeply understanding history on the present and the future. So welcome to all of you who are here with us, both on site as well as those of you who are joining us online. Now, I don't know how you can effectively follow Denise Dennis when she has said all of the amazing things like what she just said. So I'm not even going to try. She's done an amazing job of setting the stage. Here's what I want to tell you. This is the 6th year that we have held this forum on fostering racial understanding. And every year we have a specific theme. This year, that theme is a way forward. Now, in many ways, today's conversation, I think, is actually a continuation of last year's conversation, which was connecting the dots between 1776 and the present. That was with two amazing speakers, Dr. Jennifer Janofsky and our very own Michael Idris, who is our African-American Interpretive Fellow. And what that really did was explore the role of historical sites and museums in making sure that lesser told stories about people of African descent made it into the world in a variety of different ways. So in today's conversation, I really think that what we're doing is we're pulling on the thread of how the public outside of history museums, historical sites, and so on and so forth can learn these stories, and how we can use different methods of communication to get people excited about the richness of these stories, the power, the impact of these stories, and use them to make the world a better place, both now and looking ahead. I want to tell you about a couple of the things that I am listening for as we're going to get to hear from both Erin Haynes and Jesse McCarthy. I'm going to be listening to think a little bit about how we ensure that the full and complex story of our nation's past is told, including the contributions of people of African descent, essentially, as Denise said, making sure that that story is not buried. I'm going to be thinking about recognizing that in our world, there are both actors who are working in good faith and actors who are working in bad faith. How do we speak to people outside of our own bubbles to create a sense of the necessity of telling these stories, though it may feel uncomfortable or scary to do so? And for folks who maybe aren't as dynamically active in the world of our political and our social lives when we think about things around history and the news and so on and so forth, those folks who may feel less engaged, how do we speak to them? How do we activate them? How do we get them engaged? How do we keep them engaged? And I'm also thinking, especially given the roles that our two presenters play in this world, how do we use language and how do we use art in this effort? How does the means of communication matter? I want you all to also be thinking about the questions that arise as you hear their comments and you see what they're going to be sharing with us, because this, if you've attended this experience in the past, you may know this is not a passive sit back and listen experience. Our guests get actively engaged in the conversation, and that is how we like it. So what will happen at the end of the presentations is that both of our speakers are going to join me on stage for a conversation where I may start with a couple of questions, but then we're going to have a microphone that will be available for all of you in the room. And for those of you who are joining us online, we invite you to put your questions and your comments into the chat, and those are going to be shared with us so that we can actually have a conversation, a dialogue about how it is that we build a path forward. Does that sound good? Yes? Awesome. Fantastic. So what I would like to do now then is tell you a little bit about our first speaker, Erin Haynes, who we are so pleased to say is a longtime friend of the museum. Erin Haynes is a founding mother, I love that phrase, by the way, founding mother, and editor-at-large for The 19th, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom covering the intersection of women, politics, and policy. And she is also an MSNBC contributor, so you have probably seen her on TV. She is an award-winning political journalist focused on issues of race, gender, and politics, and she was previously the Associated Press national writer on race and ethnicity. She's also worked at the Washington Post, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Los Angeles Times. She was a fall of 2019 Ferris Professor at Princeton University, teaching a class on Black women and the 2020 election. And she recently joined Georgetown University's Institute of Politics as a fellow in their 5th anniversary class. Originally from Atlanta, Erin is here in Philadelphia now, and we are so lucky to have her. So Erin, come on up.
Wow, that was so generous, Adrienne. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to all of you. I am thrilled to be back in my happy place, my second living room. As Adrienne said, I am more than a friend of the museum. I'm basically a squatter here at this point. I love it here so much. And the reason that I love it is for exactly the reason that Adrienne alluded to. I mean, this is a place that has always, even before its beginnings, been committed to telling a more honest and accurate story about who we are and who we have been as a country. And that just has been deeply meaningful for me at different points, especially over the last few years, to say the least. And so this building and its lessons really nourish me so much as a citizen, and I'm really, really grateful to be part of what is going to be, I know, a very timely and urgent conversation today. And so to that end, I just want to thank the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust for asking me to participate in this event, honoring Lanae A. Moore and the legacies of both of your families. Denise, Mother Truth Teller, your revolutionary family is an inspiration. I have to say, I've seen that video before. It also chokes me up a little bit to watch, and just seeing those historical documents in particular are so moving, because what it says is that your family was here. They were present at every stage of this country's evolving democracy. And so, that record won't be erased. And those documents are proof. And Lonnie, you and Denise just are such a force for good. I look forward to the day that we are all walking the trails of the Dennis Farm together, although not with this particular weather. We will have a day hopefully warmer than this one for that. But I have to come and say hello to Prince and Phoebe and Bristol and the whole family. So stay tuned to that. I'll be bringing my boyfriend, Delano, in tow, who I also want to thank for being here with me today. And I want to thank my friends, Stephanie Bradley and her husband for being here, and Kimberly McGlon, my creative co-conspirator around our city's Black past and future, as you will see in just a few minutes. I do also have to plug my day job as editor-at-large at the 19th. As you may have guessed, our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment, but with an asterisk in our logo, and that is in recognition of the Black women who stood shoulder to shoulder with the white suffragists who frankly threw them under the bus and omitted Black women from their full access to the ballot in 1920 when the amendment became law. And so that asterisk, frankly, is part of the fuller truth telling that we do at the 19th, and it is a reminder of who remains unseen and unheard in our democracy. So as Adrian mentioned, I am not a native Philadelphian, although I'm actively working on my full John status. Stay tuned. I'm from Atlanta, and my time in those two cities has really made me reflect a lot about who gets to be a citizen and about who gets to participate in our democracy and how. As the amazing exhibit on the Fortin family that is currently open downstairs, and I will also plug this as, ambassador of this museum, Black people have been a part of America's revolutionary struggle since before we even had a country. They are part of the continuing revolution. And we know that our democracy progresses when citizens stand together to find the way forward, the theme for our conversation today. Now, some of these reflections were the seed for A More Perfect Union, which is the year-long exploration at the Philadelphia Inquirer into systemic inequality through many institutions born in our city that I was proud to lead as contributing editor, and I encourage everybody to spend some time with if you have not had a chance to do that so far. The Racial Reckoning of 2020 saw a multiracial, multi-gendered, intergenerational coalition of our neighbors, our family, our friends, and even strangers taking to the streets to make their own declarations of independence and asserting their inalienable rights to liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. So before I continue, I just want to show a short video that introduces and provides a bit more context for the project that I think will be helpful for today's conversation. So if we can just cue that up. Philadelphia is actually pretty prolific in innovating so many institutions that at the Philadelphia Inquirer that explores systemic racism through the institutions and inequality that was born in Philadelphia. I thought, what if in this city, through this newspaper, we kind of explored and unpacked systemic racism, thinking about how inequality was really right there from the start, and what the impact of those institutions not just has been, but continues to be on Philadelphians and Americans living right now.
The most impactful story for me was probably the maternal health one. It was about inequities that Black women face in maternal care. What I didn't know was that Philadelphia created modern obstetrics at the first medical school at Penn. It led me to be able to uncover the story of a Black woman from the late 19th century named Josephine Scott. She did die in childbirth, and she never did bear a living child, but After her death, the doctor who had worked on her removed part of her anatomy, her pelvic bones, and it was written that they were put on display. We weren't able to track them down. Between the different institutions that were said to have had them, nobody was accountable for them even today.
One of the things I was interested in, doing this project was kind of thinking about how are institutions choosing what stories to tell and how does it benefit them? So I wrote about the University of Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
And I wrote about how they basically said for many years that they didn't have any ties to slavery. And this was as other universities around the country were starting to uncover their own ties, and starting to kind of reckon with it. And Penn just said, nope, we're innocent. And in that story, I talked with the archivist at Penn at the time, and he talked me through some of kind of the thinking that went into how the institution chose which history to use. He said, I didn't want to look that hard in the archives because he felt like Penn didn't set up any kind of fact-finding commission. They didn't say, get to the bottom of this. They just said, hey, are there ties? He also didn't want it to result in reparations because he felt like political issues shouldn't affect how we look at history. Mm-hmm. So he basically said, as far as we know, but really we don't know.
So he was really reckoning with his own role within this institution, and to help, that helped really kind of perpetuate this inequality.
Yeah, I think he was thinking through it, and a group of students started digging into it, and they found a number of ties between Penn and the institution of slavery.
The point of investigating trauma like this isn't just to say that harm happened, but to show how we can heal, and to show that even within that there is resistance, even within that trauma there's imagination, there's spirit. So on a couple of these chapters, we're looking at the flag and all of the ways that the American flag and all of its permutations can be a source of discomfort for Black Americans because of the way that it's used. Getting Kimberly McGlaughlin from Grand Boulevard to reimagine the flag as something that we'd be proud to wear. That piece was interesting because I did get some feedback from people that may have missed that message, saying like, oh, you really think that redesigning the flag is going to fix racism? And I'm like, that's not what we're trying to say here.
Yeah, no.
The point of it is to communicate how we would like these American icons to make us feel, because they aren't doing that right now.
During 2020, when there were these huge protests over the killing of George Floyd, there was this kind of feeling in the air, a sense in the air. We can see that things are wrong and unequal, but sort of like, how did we end up here?
I don't want this to be a year of white guilt, of people just saying like, oh, we did bad in the past, we did bad in the past, right? Those decisions in the past echo today. And even if the individuals change, the systems that were created before still disproportionately affect people of color.
Philadelphia loves to focus on its past, on its foundations, right? The story that we tell ourselves, to ourselves, and also to America. But there are people for whom the Declaration still has not reached its full potential. What does it mean to really think about who the framers of our democracy can be now? We're really still only at the beginning of this work. We're certainly still at the beginning of the reckoning that started in 2020, and it is up to all of us to bring about the more perfect union that our founders envisioned.
And so as you can see in the video, the aim of A More Perfect Union was really to lay a historical foundation in the city where democracy was authored, in one of America's oldest newspapers, and really telling a fuller truth about the institutions that continue to have a disparate impact on modern day Philadelphians, in the hope that together we can be the framers of a future that is freer and fairer for our city, for our country, and for our democracy. So my main role was as contributing editor of this project, but I also wrote the introduction, which we appropriately refer to the preamble. And so I will read a bit of that now. Philadelphia is a city of American firsts. The first library, the first stock exchange, the first US Mint, the first hospital, the first penitentiary, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church are among the institutions that were born here, alongside America itself. But if our city has pioneered democracy, we must also acknowledge that it has pioneered inequality. As a proud American on the 245th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I am faced with the reality that the founding document establishing our government and young country intentionally excluded women, enslaved Black people, and Indigenous people, all of whom were present at the time of the American Revolution and who have played a critical role in the creation of a democracy in which they have never been fully allowed to participate. This is not the part of our history that we celebrate on the 4th of July, but it is history that we should acknowledge, because to not do so risks repeating the mistakes of the past and not fully embracing our founding ideals. The Declaration is a living document, and we should understand the ideal not as fixed in history, but as building blocks for a new way forward. We, the people, must be the pioneers of this generation, as the course of human events now calls us to be. We must reconcile the inequity of our origins as inconsistent with who we say we are and who we say we want to be. This is the work that we can all do as Philadelphians, because this is who we have been and who we can be. Like the framers, we may not always agree, but where better than the place we're going first is as old as democracy itself. I think a lot about the stories that we tell ourselves as Americans. There are facts of history that we are taught, names, dates, places, events, and then there are the myths that we learn about. Today, our nation is at a crossroads, forced by the national reckoning on race, and we find ourselves at the intersection of what is true and what we want to believe. The latter can be far more powerful, as the truth can be painful and sometimes hard to face. What we choose to believe in its place is soothing. It affirms our best instincts, but it is often a matter of perspective. The original Declaration was a rejection of oppression and a collection of truths amid omission, and our present day efforts should attempt to correct the record in the true spirit of journalism. We do not honor our heritage by continuing to willfully ignore the unpleasant aspects of our American story. The journalism that we produce for the More Perfect Union is meant to be the start of the conversation and the start of this work together. I look forward to continuing both with all of you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. I am looking forward to asking you some questions in a little bit. But first, I'm excited to introduce our second speaker, Jesse McCarthy. Jesse McCarthy is assistant professor in the departments of English and African American Studies at Harvard University. His writing on the intersection concerns of race, politics, and aesthetics can be found in academic journals like Novel, Transposition, and African American Review, as well as in the New York Times Book Review, N+1, I don't actually know how you say that one out loud, and Dissent and The Point. He is the author of the essay, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, winner of the 2022 Whiting Award for Nonfiction, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and a novel, The Fugitivities, published by Melville House in 2021. He recently edited and wrote a new introduction for the Norton Library's 2022 edition of W.E.B. Du Bois's classic text, The Souls of Black Folk. His forthcoming work includes Minor Notes Volume 1, an anthology of African American poetry, which will appear later this year with Penguin Classics, and a book of literary history, The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War, with the University of Chicago Press. I am very excited to hear what you're going to share with us this afternoon.
so much, everybody. Just need 2 seconds here. I'm going to get my talk out. Okay. Good afternoon. It's good. These are very tough acts to follow. It is such an honor to be here with all of you today. This is an incredibly important and very timely conversation, and I'm very, very honored to be a part of it. I need to begin first off, though, by thanking the great, the one, the only Denise Dennis. Thank you so much. You mentioned my mom. You sent her love. Hi, Mom. I don't know where to look. I want to thank you. I want to thank your family. Memory of Lonnie Moore III. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you all the folks also working behind the scenes at the Dennis Farm Charitable Trust and also at the Museum of the American Revolution for helping bring me here today. And thanks, of course, also to Aaron for being in conversation with me today. I'm so excited for this. I teach African-American literature, cultural history, and intellectual history at Harvard University. And one of the things that I regularly find when I begin my courses is that my students, despite being very bright and very eager, have a very flattened view of American history, and one that tends not to be very substantive, especially where the history of the social construction, which is really just to say the historical condition of race, is concerned. Now, I've been asked by our conveners to talk about a way forward. And so maybe it's my nature as a professor, as a teacher, my inclination is always in these circumstances to say that in order to trace a path forward, you have to have an idea of where you've come from. We actually have to look backwards. And so that's what I'm going to propose to do with you today, if I can. And necessarily this will be very abbreviated and insufficient for reasons of time. But I'm very excited to say that even already many of the things that Denise has brought forward, I thought actually about doing a whole talk about David Walker, who's a favorite and a classic text that I teach frequently. Well, there you go. There you go. But I'm going to try and trace a long and important and very difficult history to bring into focus something that I'm going to propose as a kind of argument to share with you today. And that is that we need to think about the ways in which Black and white Americans at many junctures in our history have understood and in fact desired a common path forward. And that in most of these instances, they have organized together around these common interests. But that these moments have been precarious. The gains that are made often lead to backlash and reversal, a reversal that often overwhelms those gains, even as the underlying changes that are wrought can never be entirely undone. Let's see if we can get here. So I want to begin by recalling a moment in our history that is often, I think, poorly studied, overlooked, neglected, not really discussed, but that I think is very fruitful for thinking about, in particular, the construction of race itself in the United States of America. And that is to say, we need to remember that early phase, about 60 years of colonial history between 1619 and roughly 1680 or 81, in which slavery was not, and I repeat, slavery was not systematically tied to race. This may come as a surprise to many people, and that I think suggests the extent to which our history is told so much through mythology rather than through the facts. During this period, Black people enjoyed more rights, including crucially whomever they pleased. They enjoyed more rights than they would after 1681, okay? It was a time when Black and white populations worked as indentured servants. Both Black and whites owned servants themselves and indeed slaves. And they were working on large plantations. And in at least one, it was found in Virginia, at least one county in Virginia had over a majority, over 50% of the inhabitants were found to be in an interracial marriage. That's a fact that I think should give us some pause, and we should reflect on that reality. Which leads to a natural question: what changed? What happened? Why would that moment come to an end? There's debate around this question, and it's a respectable debate, but it's one that I think should be fully investigated and thought about. Many historians, and notably Theodore Allen, have pointed to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. This was a revolt that was basically came about because this indentured servant class did not much enjoy the fact that they were being exploited, and together and basically turned on the planter class. And the revolt notably featured an alliance between both Black and white indentured servants and families working together and acting in rebellion together against their masters and against the plantation owners. And it's the contention of Theodore Allen and many others that we see a response to this on the part of the planter class power by the passage of the very first anti-miscegenation laws. I think this is really, really important for us to think about, that, you know, American law is based on British common law. And for reasons that I think are fairly easy to understand, British common law didn't have a tradition of legal personhood tied to race, okay? So the alteration here, the creation of classes of legal personhood that are directly tied to Blackness and whiteness, specifically Black males and white females, is an incredibly important alteration to our legal institutions and to the notions of race and of the law. In some ways, it's the juridical production of race in this moment. And it's arguable that it's a response to something like Bacon's Rebellion. That is to say, the planter class is seeing this as a threat, people coming together and challenging their power. One way to undermine that is to pit people against each other. And so race looks like something like a tool or a technology, as I like to call it, of social control, and one that can be used as a means to discipline labor. And I think it's not at all a coincidence that we see the same thing at the same time in the Caribbean. In particular, the French passed what they call the Code Noir, the Black Code, in 1685, and they pass it for the exact same reasons. The sugar plantations, most famously Saint-Domingue, which when its enslaved Black population will undertake the only successful slave revolution in human history in 1804 and declare in their own independence, bring this to an end. But in Saint-Domingue, in its colonial phase, is the most wealthy possession of the French colonial empire. And they're very concerned about this same problem, in particular, when there are racially mixed couples. How are we going to keep the products of those unions enslaved? Well, you pass something like the Code Noir, you pit communities against each other, and you make sure that slavery perpetuates itself through the children of people who are mixed. This leads, of course, throughout the 18th century, but in a rising crescendo, especially in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, to the abolitionist movement, which is really an extraordinary human political undertaking. It lasted for better part of 150 years. And it has, of course, an extraordinarily important presence in the history of this city, in the history of Philadelphia. You're looking at an image of Pennsylvania Hall, which was built between 1837 and 1838 by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, local abolitionist movement. And it was erected very near to where we are right today. It was its location, there's a historic marker for it, was right across from where the National Constitution Center is today. I want to note that the funds to build this building came from common people. We know this from the historical records, from workers, many of them Quakers, members especially of Philadelphia's free Black community. And notably, it was noted in the records about this that many of the original funders were women. A majority of the funders were women of both races, Black and white women. It was dedicated above all to free speech, okay? A value that we claim as Americans to hold sacred. And it was, in a sense, dedicated to allowing for the proverbial conversation about race, a conversation that I note we are still having here today. The building was immediately destroyed. It was burned to the ground by a mob of rioters who, according to the historian Noel Ignatieff, were especially incensed because they saw white and Black people entering the building together arm in arm, okay, which violated many of the kind of social taboos and codes around the social segregation of Black and white people. And so I think this hall, both its building and its destruction, is a really important symbol, a metaphor, if you will, for both the potential, but also the backlash to Black and white solidarity in the cause to overcome racial division. It's important to note, though, right, that none of this deterred Black and white abolitionists from working together. And there is a heroic and remarkable history of interracial cooperation abolitionist causes in this city. James Fortin and the Fortin family are intimately involved with this, and I encourage everyone to go see this extraordinarily important exhibition, which helps to correct the record and tell this story. To just cite one example, and we could go on and on because it's an incredibly dense and rich history. These two extraordinary heroes, William Still and Passmore Williamson, worked together on some of the more famous cases that especially began to arise after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, cases like that of Jane Johnson or Maria Weems, who actually escaped famously by dressing in male attire, disguising herself as a man. And I want to say, these were some of the kind of famous, more sort of, they got a lot of, media attraction, if we want to use that term, we might apply to it today. But in many ways, they were part of a much broader and kind of ferocious tide of activity that laid the political groundwork for the action, for legal action in the House and the Senate that led to the possibility of passing the Reconstruction Amendments that have been so crucial, indeed so decisive, for securing rights for millions of Americans ever since. That period, the period of the Reconstruction Amendments, was an opportunity in our history to get things right. It was a moment of great hope and great possibility. And I think one of the things we need to change so much in the way we think about our history is how we tell the story of Reconstruction, which, as we've seen, has been so distorted and maligned, and intentionally so. But part of what people, I think, often fail to understand is that Reconstruction posed a threat because democracy was working. People forget that many states in the South, including Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, all had over 50% Black population. In other words, if the franchise were applied immediately, white supremacy would be de facto impossible. And not only that, whites and Blacks were joining together on what they called biracial fusion tickets. Okay, these were the radical Republicans in the South, and they were coming together in order to do what? To do things like introduce free universal education for the first time in the South. They had to raise taxes in order to do that. That was very unpopular. But part of the point is that the ballot box, and that's why you had the Ku Klux Klan come into play. That's why you had a surge in lynching during this period. Because when democracy is actually majoritarian, if you can't win at the ballot box, then you resort to violence. So that these phenomena have to be understood in relationship to political history and not just abstractly. I think that's a really important point. W.B. Du Bois understood this, and in his great study, a massive tome, Black Reconstruction in America, he makes this point very explicitly. He says, there was but one way to break up this threatened coalition, and that was to unite poor and rich whites by the shibboleth of race, and despite divergent economic interests. The work of secret orders in 1868 to 1872, and when he says secret orders there, he's referring specifically to the Ku Klux Klan, right? Frustrated any mass movement toward the union of white and Black labor, okay? In other words, Du Bois understood that racial terrorism was a political weapon, and it was being used to break the possibility of a democratic coalition that would improve justice, but economic opportunity for all. We need to understand, I think, that this in some sense reflects, again, I would say a disturbing trend today, right? That is to say, a willingness to resort to violence when a democratic majority can't be established, a willingness to resort to intimidation when you can't win the battle of ideas. We also don't talk that much about the ways in which, in this period, the same thing that we see all the way back in the colonial period continues to influence our society at the level of interpersonal relations at their most intimate point. Many people are often familiar with cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, probably one of the most notorious sort of segregationist policies handed down by the Supreme Court, but it's not the only terrible decision handed down by the Supreme Court. We should remember Pace v. Alabama from 1883, which upheld Alabama's anti-miscegenation laws, okay? It was a felony for a Black white person to get married. It was a felony for them to engage in sexual union of any kind. And it's important to note that these laws stayed on the books until the Supreme Court overturned them in Loving v. Virginia, but that's in 1967. Okay, it's really important to think about how recent in our history it was a felony for Blacks and whites to engage in marriage together. I think it's really important to think about that. And it gets me to another final point, which is that as we've already seen, whether it be in the case of abolition, if you go all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion, when people have come together in ways that have been particularly powerful, potent, successful, it's often been through an alliance. It's been through cooperation. It's been through people seeing across, and despite all of the attempts to pit them against each other, to make them fearful of each other. And of course, we saw that in the civil rights movement, which was powerfully supported by ordinary people and activists, both Black and white, who saw through the mask of racial division and courageously joined together to push the system to adopt a different path forward and to bring a new sense of hope and change to the country. And to me, in a sense, this is sort of just to sum up my argument, and then I'll end my lecturing, but it's to say that it suggests that when we ask about a way forward, one of the things we can do is ask ourselves, what is it? What are the things that are in the interests of ordinary working people in this country? And what happens when we affirm those? What happens when we decide to say, let's think about that first and foremost? What are the things that we actually all need and all want? I think sometimes about something as simple as drinking water. And I'll remind folks that in one of our state capitals, Jackson, Mississippi, today, we are unable to get clean drinking water to our population. This is in the richest country on earth, a country that has plans to send missions to Mars and so on and so forth. How is that possible? How is such a moral outrage even conceivable? It tells us that we have so much work left to do, but as I hope to have tried to persuade you in this, the things that we see is that when people come out together, the powers that be tremble. And when the powers that be start to tremble, we also see another pattern emerge, which is they begin, as they always have done, going all the way back to the colonial period, to trot out new excuses, new methods for scaring people into returning to their boxes of identity and accepting something less than a fully just society. Our history shows us that this pattern is recurrent, that this is not a linear story. There is progress, there is also regression, but the tide never stops from surging forward. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Test.
Thank you. You're welcome. All right. All right. Whew. Everyone take a deep breath.
Listen.
That was a lot and that was amazing. And I feel inspired and I feel like I have lots of questions I want to ask you, but I'm also very aware that we've got an audience of folks who are also going to want to engage in conversation with you all. So I'm going to keep myself a little bit back as we go through this. Thank you to both of you for your comments. One of the things that was a clear thread in what each of you said was the importance of the role of interracial cooperation. And when I think in particular about the asterisk on the 19th, what happens when that falls short, right? What happens when the promises of that don't actually come to fruition? So I want to ask you all to think about the work that you all do. So Erin, you are a journalist, you are an amazing writer, et cetera, et cetera. Jesse, you are an educator and an author. How do you see the impact of your work on people broadly? And then specifically, what role do you think that your work plays in fostering interracial cooperation?
Yeah, I think what we know is that when people are omitted from our democracy, that democracy is not living up to its fullest potential, right? We are not being true to our founding ideals when everyone is not allowed to participate in this democracy. One of the things that I love about this museum, one of the things again that I will not spoil the entire thing, but you know, we know that Fortin was present at the time of the Declaration of Independence. He was a young boy when the Declaration was read aloud, you know, in public, and he heard those words and he knew that those words applied to him, even as you know, a Black person in this burgeoning democracy. He knew that there were other Black people, there were women, there were Indigenous folks who heard those words and knew that they applied to them, even if they were not written into that document. And so the work of creating a freer and fairer democracy, the work of making those ideals real, frankly, is you know, to my thinking, the work of journalism. And so helping people to understand the connection between democracy and their daily lives, that's part of my job, part of our job. At the 19th, we wouldn't be named for an amendment around voting, right? If we were not thinking about really how people engage civically with their country, and voting is really such an important, it really is a beginning step for so many people. And you know, we know that it is valuable because we know that there are people actively working to take that away. And so helping people to kind of understand those connections is also the work of journalism. I think at the end of the day, journalism should be a public service. And so we seek to do that for our audiences each and every day, and to do it in a way that lets people understand that they are all welcome to join in the conversation that we hope to create through the work that we do.
And before I turn it over to Jesse, I want to follow up on that with what sort of, what feedback have you received in particular on A More Perfect Union?
So, well, I'll talk about A More Perfect Union and the 19th, because I think the aim for me as a journalist is, certainly there are so many stories that have already been written, already been told, but to the extent that there are stories that have not been fully told, that people are not aware of, making them aware, people appreciate that, and for us to really correct the record, to leave behind a more honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a democracy is something that feels like really our best and highest work, especially in this moment, as you know, Denise talked about with folks who are seeking to obscure that fuller and more accurate and honest history. And so what people said, we got, reaction, both positive and negative, frankly, from A More Perfect Union. People who, again, want to kind of hold on to the origin stories, the myths, frankly, that make people feel good about who we are as a democracy, and don't really want to talk about, when it comes to the things that we love, the stories of the founders, the framers, we can't talk about those stories enough. But when it comes to, kind of the uglier parts of what it took for us to get to this democracy, like, well, we need to move on from those parts, right? That's not, you have to tell the whole truth about this country if you're going to talk about what America is and who we are and who we have been and who we can be. And so there's certainly some resistance to that, even as there is an appreciation, especially from people who have felt excluded, especially for people who maybe had feelings about how certain things are, why is my neighborhood like this? Why isn't my water as good as the water on the other side of town? Well, it was frankly built into, the beginnings of this city, the beginnings of our country in terms of how people thought about infrastructure. It was a property right. Water was a property right, not a human right. It was a property right. And so when you go into something with that mentality, and Philadelphia is a pioneer of that, then, you're choosing winners and losers often around race, right? And so modern day Philadelphian is still experiencing the legacy of that initial mentality. And so to be able to connect the dots for people in that way is something that feels very affirming, because it is crazy making to kind of see your circumstances and not fully understand why certain things are the way that they are. At the 19th, I will say, people having access to information, it's not just enough for folks to know about certain people's stories. They want to get involved. They want to know what they can do, right? And so giving people really the tools to participate in their democracy, not telling people who to vote for, how to vote, nothing like that. But if you want to participate in your democracy, how to figure out, where it is that you need to vote, what you need to do to make sure that you're registered on time. Those types of things are extremely helpful to people. A map letting people know what the state of reproductive rights is where you live. Because it is confusing, and they're trying to navigate that. And so providing that, and by the way, providing it for free for everyone to consume and free for other outlets to republish is something that we also feel is helpful, because it's not enough just to cover communities that have been historically marginalized if they don't have access to the stories that we are writing about and on their behalf.
All right, thank you for that. Jesse, same question.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking, and Erin, is the work that you're doing is so important. And one of the things that it makes me think is, in a democracy, if that's what it is, the people have to actually have the power, right? They have to be empowered to be a part of the, controlling, giving direction and giving purpose to the direction that the country is actually taking.
Agency. Yes, where is their agency?
Exactly. And so how is that even possible if they access, if they don't have the tools, if they don't have the information, right? And so, I always think about, journalism is not only so crucial for its purpose of kind of, disseminating information, but it's really about conferring civic agency to all of us so that we can actually be what we're supposed to be, which is citizens, right? Responsible citizens who have a kind of say and a view about where we're taking the country collectively. In my role as an educator and as a writer, I think in some ways I think of what I do through the same lens. That is to say, I think of it as a kind of a civic good or civic duty. Educating children is extraordinarily important. In case they're not really children, but they're young people who are going to be taking the country forward in the years to come. In terms of, kind of writing essays for the public, I think about how important it is to oxygenate the public debate, which oftentimes gets kind of clotted or becomes stuffed with the opposite of truth and often something like mythology. And there's good reason for that, which is to say that, I think, and I see this in my students all the time, the myths we tell ourselves can be very consoling. They can be very comforting. But what's interesting is that the myths always have contradictions. The myths are not coherent. And actually, when I'm able to guide my students to the more complicated historical record and set of facts, they're not actually oftentimes, disappointed or traumatized, but they realize, oh, the real story is much more interesting. It's actually much more exciting. And part of it is because the myths, while they are consoling, aren't actually explaining. They're pretending to explain. They're sort of counterfeit explanations. But if you want to really understand, why is this block so different from that block? If you really want to understand the society around you, you actually do have to do the work of history. You need quality journalism. You need, a serious and rigorous conversation and debate to oxygenate, the political process in a democracy, which is supposed to be deliberative, right?
Yeah, and history is empowering when it is inclusive.
Yeah.
It is
Absolutely.
disempowering when it is not inclusive. If you don't see yourself in the story, if you are literally erased, if we don't have those documents from Denise's family saying that they were present in these wars, over the course of our history, we understand why it is valuable for some people to want to omit
That's right.
that story.
Absolutely.
And what I appreciate about what both of you just did, so Jesse, you started in your presentation by mentioning that myths can be soothing, right? They can calm us, they can help us to feel good. And Erin, you pointed out that when people don't understand why things are the way that they are crazy making, right? And what you've just brought together is that the myths are only soothing at the surface level. The minute that we actually try to understand the why, we get to that complication and that discomfort. So you've pulled out something that I think is really interesting. Jesse, I think it in particular came out in your presentation, is that you talked about the creation of race as a subjugating ideology in relationship to class consciousness. And that is a question that I was going to ask about. And that gets challenging real fast, right? When you start to talk about what happens when you pull class unity together, right? Instead of racial unity. But I wonder, as we think about interracial cooperation, as we think about fostering racial understanding, as we think about a way forward and moving our nation together, like what is the role of class consciousness?
It's a difficult question.
I'm glad it went to you.
I guess, one thing that I will say is that I think that it's important to think about the ways in which race so often is weaponized, right? And often very effectively and very deliberately in order to, in very concrete and specific political contexts, right? In order to prevent or disempower some broader passage of something that would threaten powerful interests, usually powerful economic interests. I think in and of itself, that's something that's worth contemplating. What conclusions you want to draw from that, I suppose, is up to different people and their different sense of politics. But I think already at least acknowledging that does something important, which is to make people reconsider what is one of the most dangerous and also one of the most terrible and misfortunate aspects of race, which is the way in which it's naturalized as a category, in which lay people often really genuinely believe, right? And they genuinely believe that there's a kind of coherence to thinking in these terms, when in fact, the coherence that racial terms have is ascriptive and social, right? I have to say to people, fictions can be extremely powerful. One of my favorite analogies when I'm talking to my students is to talk about money, to talk about currency. Currency is a fiction. It's a piece of paper, but if I give you, $100 bill, there's some real concrete effects to that. You can go spend it. And if I take away a $100 bill from you, you're going to be upset, right? And rightly so. And similarly with race, something that is a socially agreed upon convention in fiction can have very real consequences, right? And so one of the things that, I think is important is, on the one hand, to use this question to kind of get at the notion of kind of false naturalization of race, to think about its implication in our politics and the way in which it's so often weaponized. And then I would say more broadly on the question of, something like class interests, we can look at the country through the lens of a labor history. I mean, we can look at the country through the lens of political economy. And one of the things that I think we see there is that, people often ask, why is it that we don't have healthcare in this country? Every other advanced democracy in the world has healthcare. Well, one answer looks like race. Okay, the ways in which, because if you look, for instance, to Europe and the social democracies there that have universal healthcare, one reason they have it is because the labor movements that pushed for and got it passed didn't have to deal with the division of race that has broken that possibility here. So I think these are very, you can see these in a very kind of concrete and pragmatic way in terms of things that we have and haven't gotten, and that affect enormous, numbers of people, and differentially by class, because obviously if you have a lot of money and you happen to be wealthy, healthcare is less important to you, less necessary than if you're poor and working.
And here's just to pick up on what our possible Bitcoin promoter was just talking about. I'm like, wait, money is a fiction. What's happening, Jesse? Where are we going?
Get into crypto.
This is why the truth matters, right? Because when we're talking about, whether we're talking about race or class, when we have a shared set of facts, when we can come together as Americans around a shared set of facts, we can begin to understand our shared fate, regardless of race or class, that we are all in this together, that we're supposed to be all in this together, that we can move forward together and not leave everybody behind. That last picture that you showed in your presentation, Jesse, of that sea of protesters in Philadelphia who were gathered together. I mean, I saw this literally from my apartment. I'm sure a lot of y'all saw too, because they were marching right down Broad Street, which is, the neighborhood that I live in, marching right down this way. And you saw people of all ages, of all races, of all genders who were standing together day after day after day. They were out in the middle of a pandemic. This was pre-vaccine.
That's right.
Okay, so they felt that strongly about their democracy that they were willing to risk their health to be in the streets to say, this is not okay. And that what happens to me today could be you tomorrow. And so we are going to lock arms and we are going to be here together. And that was an extremely powerful moment for our city. And I think for cities across this country.
I'm going to pull in a question from our friends online. So Curtis Johnson wants to know, continuing down this path, what is the role of American business, corporate America, in perpetuating the status quo, and how might it serve as a catalyst to bring more equity?
Sure. Hi, Curtis. So I think what I would say to that, I think we saw this around the voter suppression laws that you saw in the wake of the 2020 election, right? Where you had Georgia, even though 3 times you have the election results counted, verified, as accurate and secure. And yet you had a state legislature that then comes back on the other side of that and passes laws that make it more difficult for certain populations to cast a ballot: older people, poorer people, Black and brown folks, people from the disability community, and others who, maybe were not intended to be impacted by this law, but certainly we're going to have challenges as a result of some of the things that were included in this law. And so you had the activist community really challenging the business community in Georgia. You had the All-Star Game pull out of Georgia, out of Atlanta that year for particularly that reason, because of that law, pulls out of the All-Star Game, and the All-Star Game has to move to another city. Similarly in Texas, when Texas passes voter suppression laws, you have businesses being challenged to take a stand, to weigh in, to say that this is not good for it's not good morally, but it's also not good economically, right? To be a state that is doing these things. You've also seen businesses, or you've seen calls for boycotts in places that want to create laws that are anti-LGBTQ, right? But really, I think, especially in this pandemic, you have had so many folks who are wanting, consumers who are wanting the businesses that they support to be morally responsible, right? To have some set of values that maybe mirror their own. They are speaking, voting, spending money with their wallets and their values seeing that connection on both sides, right? And so I think that that is definitely a dynamic that is happening, and there does seem to look. The bottom line is that corporations are already playing a role in our politics, right? But now there is more of a demand from the consumer class about what type of role they will play going forward.
The only thing I could really add to that, I think, is to say that I think from a common sense perspective, we understand the ways in which at the end of the day, you know, a kind of toxicity, a kind of social toxicity and bad feeling, really grave and kind of very obvious widespread inequality, the social costs that are sort of evident, you would think, I'll put it this way, you would think would make folks in the business community think, okay, maybe my most short-term interest this month or next month is not necessarily to be alleviating poverty in Philadelphia, but what about my longer-term interest, right? What about, you know, I mean, if it continues to be the case that, you know, when people, you know, think of Philadelphia, and mostly because of certain right-wing channels, what they think of and see as sort of social dysfunction and homelessness and poverty, is that going to lessen visitors to the city of Philadelphia and therefore ultimately not be great for my situation and my business? It's a longer-term view, but it's one that's rational and makes sense. You know, I think there is a way in which, you know, if they can play a role, and I would urge them to try and reconceive of themselves as virtuous civic actors and therefore take that longer view. Then you say alleviating poverty, first and foremost, reducing inequality, improving access of opportunity, being a good civic steward is actually very much in my own interests. It's just that I need to think in a broader and more long-term way and not so narrowly about the end of the month.
So there's a business case there. Yeah. So I want you all to be thinking about whether you've got any questions that you would like to ask our panelists. I'm also going to invite folks from online to think about what you might want to drop into the chat while I ask one additional question of folks. So be thinking about that. Our friend Lonnie is going to be walking around this space with a microphone to come to you if you do have a question. So I would like to ask, as we think about how to move forward, what is a way forward? What we've seen is that often when we take steps forward as a society, there is then a backlash, there is then a pendulum swing in the other direction. Do you all think it's possible to avoid that? How can we prepare to prevent that from happening in the future as we think about moving towards justice? And if it's not possible to avoid it, how is it that we can prepare at least to meet that moment and try to be successful? Easy question.
No, look, I mean, I think what we are up against, those of us who do want to be in coalition to get to that more perfect union, recognizing that is a vocal minority, right? That the majority of us say that democracy, a more inclusive democracy, is what we want, right? But we're not always as vocal about that as the forces that are not trying to bring that into existence. And so I think that there are people who are recognizing, one, that they need to, more people recognizing they need to get off the sidelines, but also that they need to be more vocal. I've seen that in my own kind of social media feeds, for sure. I see that in the people that we talk to at the 19th every day, right? People who didn't understand that they needed to be more vocal, that you know, them having values, you know, that they were keeping private was not serving this democracy, right? And that their role, thinking about what their role as a citizen is. Events like Charlottesville, events like the insurrection that made them want to say, no, this is not who I am as an American, and really wanting to speak out and say that when you see, you know, incidences of violence against the Asian American community, for example, violence against, you know, the Jewish community, the ongoing killing of Black Americans by law enforcement. So understanding there's a theory, and I know Jesse is probably familiar with it as well. It's called convergence theory, right? And what it says is that people literally have to have skin in the game before they care enough to actually act on something, right? You are seeing that, voting rights is something that people who didn't look like us didn't necessarily think affected them. But guess what? Other people potentially disenfranchised by some of these laws, and now all of a sudden insurrection happens. We need to do something. We need to do something right now, right? Reproductive rights. You had Black and brown women on the front lines for years, before the fall of Dobbs last year. Guess what? All of a sudden, white women maybe don't have access. We need to do something right now. This is an outrage, right? And so I think people don't always have to wait to have skin in the game. I think that's the other part of it. That is what it takes a lot of times. But again, shared set of facts can lead to a shared fate, a sense of shared fate among more of us. And I think that's what it's going to take.
One thing I want to follow up on, or maybe two things. One of them is thinking about the diversity that exists with any of the different groups that we're talking about. So we think about Black and brown women, but depending upon, for example, their religious beliefs, they might actually be on different sides of issues that we think that we might all be on one side of. And so how do we account for that level of diversity within the communities that we're trying to pull together to ensure that justice prevails in this nation, number one. And then number two, thinking about the use of language. We know that people use certain words,
Yes.
but do not mean the same thing.
Yes.
Right? Whether it is democracy, whether it is justice, whether it is, liberty, and all sorts of other things that oftentimes we talk about here at the museum, and that shows up in the work that you all do. So how do we begin to build a shared vocabulary when we're at different stages in our personal progressions along this road? How do we pull all of that together to be effective?
Well, I'll speak to the first part of your question first. None of these groups, not around gender, not around race, none of them are a monolith, right? But I think what I would say to your question is that seeking out, bringing together, what we found at the 19th is bringing people together around issues, regardless of their background, regardless of their political ideology. When you bring people together around issues, there are ways to find common ground. There are ways to find shared experience even that allow you to have dialogue that is civic and civil in a way that we seem to have lost, in kind of these echo chambers that we find ourselves in this very politically divided climate that we exist in currently. So, I think you can tell on social media, people do want to be in conversation, right? But barriers to people feeling that they are welcome to be part of that conversation, and language is a huge part of that, right? There are some words, depending on who you are, that are non-starters, for a conversation, that are not going to make people feel welcome or open to thinking that they can civilly engage with their neighbor, with their friend, with their family member. I know a lot of people sick of not having folks at Thanksgiving. Be nice to have everybody back and just have a nice, be able to talk about issues without it being so contentious, right? But that's really not where we are, but it's where we need to get back to, right? Because that is part of the fabric of our democracy in a lot of ways. The echo chambers, I think just, Lonnie's suggestion of just getting up and introducing yourself to somebody that you don't know. Too many of us are siloed into communities that kind of affirm who we are and what we believe, and not, I think the last several election cycles, the surprise that too many people have felt is just a reminder of how many folks are in community, but don't actually know their friends, their neighbors, their kids, parents, friends, their church members. Like they're not actually in relationship with these folks in the way that we should be, in the way that is necessary for us as citizens in a democracy.
All right, thank you for that. And then Jesse, same question about pendulum swings. Is it possible to prevent that? How do we meet that? And then if you've got ruminations on language or sort of intergroup diversity, very interested in all of that. And I will encourage you to be thinking about your questions because I'm coming to y'all next.
Well, I'm not sure you can avoid pendulum swings, and partly because, you know, in some sense, I think ours are particular. And when I say ours, I mean, you know, here in the United States of America, we have a particular dialectic and dynamic around race because of the way in which this country was founded. But other countries have their own dynamics, and you see swings there. You know, one of the things to understand, I think, at the end of the day, right, is that societies are dynamic. You know, change is the norm. Societies don't remain static no matter what. So, you know, at the end of the day, part of what's at stake is thinking about your relationship to the civic in the first place. A lot of people, and I think it's one of the unfortunate things about some of the features of our market economy, is that they place people, they encourage a certain kind of apathy. They encourage a certain kind of passivity, sense that, look, you know, things are basically the way they are. And we see this in a lot of data. You know, there's still a lot of apathy in the country. There's still a lot of people who just don't vote. There's a lot of people who are disgusted with politicians, with the political system in general, who don't really want to be involved. And I think, you know, one of the things that says and signals is that in some sense, they're both they're confused about the nature of the country that they're living in, and they're also not finding a way to be in deliberative connection with
From our democracy.
They're disconnected, right? They're disconnected, which is always a bad thing, always a dangerous thing as well, right? And it's precisely the kind of environment in which the kinds of myths we've been discussing proliferate and are even more effective, especially, as you say, Erin, when people are siloed already and are not really talking to each other.
Who's filling that void?
Exactly. And you know, what I would say is that one of the things that I think about is, you know, taking the long view. You know, we also we have a lot of hard work to do, and democracy is hard work. You know, living in community is hard work. You know, even at the level of a household, you know, it's work. Things have to get done, and people have to work it out. You know, if it's going to work, you can't just have some people who are just sitting back, you know, and let everyone else, you know, take care of things. And it's no different at in a larger sense of our national community. The good thing, in my view, is in some ways that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And it's part of also what I like about invoking the history is I think it's important for us to understand how much we have a tendency, I think, in the present to emphasize, and for good reason, and for very important reasons politically, a kind of sense of pessimism about how, you know, the failures of our democracy, which are extremely real. But it's important to understand that people have made tremendous sacrifices. People have worked extremely hard, taken extraordinary risks to make our own lives possible at all. And we stand on their shoulders. And one of the things I try and emphasize to my students, you know, is you have to understand that, you know, from my perspective, I stand in a tradition, you know, of people who, we stand in a tradition of people who came before us, and especially in the African-American community, that history is sort of foundational, it's bedrock. It's been a struggle from the beginning. Nothing was given. Everything had to be fought for.
And that we're on a continuum.
And we're on a continuum.
Right? That work continues. That's not just fixed in black and white photo
Absolutely.
from, from 50 and 60 years ago.
That's
like
absolutely
that work
right.
continues.
That's absolutely right. And so I think, and so I say to them, you know, if you think about what those people endured, the decisions that they made, the things they fought for under the conditions that they faced, how can we fail to do any less?
Yes.
And shouldn't we actually be doing even more, right? Shouldn't we be even more sort of seizing the moment and seizing the time and saying, you know, we hold the responsibility of that history, but not only as like a kind of burden or a weight, but also with a sense of the opportunity with the greater power that we have, with the greater, I would say, among other things, moral authority that we have to push even further for even more people in even, you know, undreamed of directions that generations before hadn't even yet begun thinking about.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, especially because one of the things that we've been telling people that we want them, or at least that I've been telling people, I want them to get out of the Black Founders exhibit downstairs, is the inspiration that the Fortin family and the larger Philadelphia Black community and communities were working in difficult times, but we're still able to pull together and make positive change. And if they could do that then, given the things that they were facing, what on earth could we achieve if we work together today?
Yes. And
Yeah.
just seeing that is possible, seeing that there is a precedent for that, right? A precedent that is hundreds of years old, right? The value of the way forward by looking backwards, right? Being fortified by those folks who were standing shoulder to shoulder, right? And for people who maybe didn't get it right or get everything right, an opportunity for us to do that now. At the 100th anniversary of suffrage, we were very honest about the fact that folks were omitted, but also as an invitation that it doesn't have to continue to be this way, that every generation continues to be vigilant or should be vigilant about protecting this democracy. And so what are you going to do? None of us have to ask, what would we have done 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? What are you going to do right now? Right? Because your democracy needs you to be active and engaged right now to write the next chapter, to be the new framers of where we go as a democracy from here.
And if I could just really quickly on, because you asked this question about different communities, there's this extraordinary, there's so many extraordinary speeches and essays by Frederick Douglass, and many people know, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, but so few people know his magnificent essay from 1869, Our Composite Nationality, Our Composite Nation, as it's sometimes referred to, in which, and I teach this at Harvard, and it's been very interesting teaching it right now in this moment, he makes this extraordinary and impassioned case for the inclusion of Asian Americans in the national body politic, okay? At a moment when nativists are pushing for their exclusion, the Chinese Exclusion Act and so on and so forth. And here you have this man, right, born a slave with the trajectory that we know and understand, right? And the politics that involves, saying, I want a home for these people too, that the home that I have had to fight for should also rightfully be theirs. To understand that we have a tradition of thinking in this way, I think is extraordinarily important. And it's remarkable to me that, for instance, an essay and a speech and a set of proposals about what American democracy could and should be is so often neglected. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. I think it's not entirely a coincidence that it is neglected, and that instead what people want to do is pit various communities together around affirmative action at my university, a problem which in many ways is really only particularly or especially interesting for an elite class of citizens to begin with. So I think it's really interesting and important for us to remember that even on questions that we may think do not necessarily imply class may be there, and also that we have a richness in our tradition that sometimes goes untapped, and sometimes precisely because it has been neglected for reasons, because it's inconvenient to those empowered to remember it.
I like this because going back to our theme of fostering racial understanding and thinking about the first question I asked about interracial cooperation, it reminds us that that's not just about Black and white. And it reminds us that people who are not a part of the dominant group in society need to be allies for and with one another. So that's really powerful. I would like to open it up to some folks in the room. We got one question asked from our folks online. So I'd like to see if we have maybe a starting question in this space that we'd like to get to. Lonnie, I see a hand. Oh. So we will do two in this room. We'll do you, sirs.
I wanted to ask the panel, specifically the professor, on the movement, it seems like the static that's going on to remove African American studies from curriculums across the nation. You touched on it, but specifically, you see there's the tradition of static pushback against freedom-minded people, righteous-minded people. It's one of your feelings on that. Why is it a different static?
One of the things that I think of when this question comes up is it gets back in a sense to the theme of my talk, right? Which is, it strikes me that one should look at the timing. And doesn't it look when you kind of pull back like this is politically expedient and motivated? That it's in a sense strategic, you know? It strikes me that I'm sure there's some sense in which there are larger sort of social and ideological forces at play here, but I think there's also a kind of obvious proximate cause, which has to do with very specific political ambitions by very specific politicians who we could name, who have presidential ambitions for themselves, and who know that you can use race to move the dial one way or another to get into power, right? And there's such a long and deep tradition of this in this country, of using race to manipulate people in order to climb your way cynically to power. And so at the end of the day, to me, it's you mentioned this, the question of good faith and bad faith actors. In some sense, what we have to understand is that sometimes you're up against bad faith actors. It's not a matter of persuading a bad faith actor because they know they're acting in bad. They know that it's not true. They know that it doesn't make sense. They know that what they're saying are lies, right? They know that already. They're doing what they're doing because they want to get power.
And because unfortunately it has worked too.
And
We've seen it work too many times.
They've seen it work.
in our politics.
So how do we know that we can't change the bad faith actors, but we know that often there are people who in good faith follow along with the arguments that are being made because they do feel endangered. They do feel scared. They do feel that there is something to be concerned about and they want to see that honestly addressed, even if they may be being misled. What do we do about that? If you all have a light answer.
I think what I would say is, we don't give up on our fellow citizens, right? Like we continue to try to engage to the extent that there are people that are still reachable that, because what happens, especially, in journalism, we know that the decimation of local news in cities, communities across this country the void has been filled by people with viewpoints that are not always, what they are giving people in as a replacement is not necessarily news, it's information, right? But sometimes misinformation, disinformation, and not necessarily news. And so, who is filling the void for those folks when they are not getting the facts? I think not turning our back on those folks and trying to still figure out ways to reach them. Because what I know is, look, going back, 10 years or more, I have friends, folks I've known from high school who would share my stories because they know me, I'm a journalist that they know and recognize and trust, would share my stories on social media alongside something that might as well have been Hillary Clinton's alien baby. And I'm just like, wait, but for, people are hungry for more information, but like the idea that they may equate what I'm doing to misinformation that is much more sophisticated than the Inquirer when you were at the checkout when I was small, right? It is much more sophisticated than that. And so, but what I know is that there are a lot of people, even if you have bad actors who are absolutely intentionally lying to people. I have friends and family and neighbors who do not want to intentionally be lying to the people in their lives. And so how do we help them with that, right? They may not trust a news source, but they may trust you or me or Jesse to tell them something and to take that as the truth.
And if we keep talking to them, maybe we get them back at Thanksgiving.
Maybe we get them back.
Jesse, any thoughts on that before I turn it over to our friend in the striped shirt?
Well, the one thing that I often think of is that, we talked about, giving people the tools and I'm an educator. I think one of the tools that helps people, faced with this, fire hose of, bad information is education, right? And part of the which, you know, I mean, all of these things kind of circle back to each other, but it strikes me that we ought to be able to try and appeal to, at least one would hope, that most people, regardless of their, you know, where they live in the country and their, you know, political orientations, if, you know, if they have children, that they want their children to get a good education. And that there ought to be room to have a conversation about why it is that our educational standards are so bad, why it is that they're so uneven, why it is that, you know, public education in this country is not well and has not been well for some time, and to appeal to that as an interest, right? As an interest that, in fact, you know, most working people have a direct, real interest in, because their kids do have to go to a public school, and they should, for the most part, do want their kids to have a good education. I think if we can, I think this is sort of my point, which is that underneath the misdirections, people do still have real interests. And to the extent that you can, you know, ground an appeal back to those things, you know, obviously people in bad faith, you know, there's only so much you can do, but I think there will still be some people in good faith who will say, well, maybe I disagree about this, maybe I disagree about that, but maybe we should put some more money into the public school system because this is not actually good. And where am I going to send my kids?
I feel like we could almost have a whole symposium just on what a good education is,
Yes.
what that means
That
to different
language,
people.
the language.
is
That's right. All of it.
so in contention right now in particular. You've got a question.
So trying to sort of just answer this, but ultimately, do you believe that convergence theory, that the government of false mythos is enough to bring people, not necessarily bad faith actors, maybe those more neutral actors who are just disengaged, to the table? I mean, it's in the name of the symposium today. It all, you know, begins with us. We're obviously here to support what you're doing. How do we maybe reach out and bring more people to the table that don't even know that they have a seat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is about the trust that people in our networks put in us, right? I mean, people in communities, they may never, you know, meet a politician that they are following or supporting or voting for, but they know you, right? And so, you know, again, I think there are a lot of people who have gotten off the sidelines and said, you know, not necessarily to be, you know, political, but they care about the direction of this country and they are wanting to come together in community with other people who care about the direction of this country. And so, you know, I think there were a lot of people who did not necessarily want to talk about politics with people that they know, much less people they don't know, right? But who are understanding that it is important to do that for us to be able to move forward together, right? So I think that's probably what I would say is that people, even if it is uncomfortable, need to get comfortable with having those conversations with the people in their lives first, and then maybe with the people who are not in their lives, but who, like I said, may also care about what is happening in their community and in their country and democracy.
To answer this, I mean, I feel like I actually come up against this question a lot just in the context of teaching, because in a sense, part of what I'm trying to do is try to sort of, you know, reach these minds and in some sense have them think something they haven't thought before, right? And one of the things that, you know, I often think about is that's one of the reasons why, that's the gentleman's question about, you know, also the stuff that's going on in Florida. It's always funny to me that people get into a certain kind of hysteria about this. You know, I think, you know, how many of you have actually been in a classroom? It's very hard to indoctrinate kids. You know what I'm saying? Like I could get up there and just be like, you all have to believe leftism and Marx, and they'd be like, get out of here, man. Like, what are you talking about? You know, and that's why
You're going to hear about that in the evaluation.
but, you know, I mean, And as I've said to people, I mean, my same students are indoctrinated every single attempt. There's an attempt to indoctrinate them every single day about the virtues of the free market. It's called advertising, but a lot of them are still skeptical. A lot of them still like, man, I don't understand why I don't have healthcare. So, you know what I'm saying? In other words, part of what I often say to people is you can't necessarily forcibly convert people. You can't, I don't think, and I'm not sure that's necessarily what you need to do. What I prefer to do is to try and point out the incoherence, right? And to seed questions, to create the space of doubt. Go with what the people are saying, and then and this is where history, knowledge, real facts, journalism can be really powerful and potent, because as I say, the real story is always so much more complicated than the myths that people are holding on to. So there's always room to create those questions and that doubt.
And you are also fostering a culture of civil dialogue in that
Exactly.
classroom, right? So they are
Exactly.
getting, as young people, getting practice in having conversations where even if they don't disagree, that they don't
right.
necessarily have to be disagreeable, can
That's
take
right.
that out into the world as citizens.
Exactly.
More opportunities for that too, I think, are what we need to be looking for, whether you're in a college classroom setting or wherever you are,
Wherever.
your workplace,
Mhm.
whatever, but figuring out ways to be in civil dialogue with the people in whatever community it is that you are in.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate that question. And if you all don't mind, I want to turn it back around on all of you, both in the room and who are joining us online. So you lift it up, just like, how when you're watching a movie and you hear them say the name of the movie in the dialogue and you're like, I get it. Lifting up the name of this, it begins with each of us, is really important. So we've got a couple minutes, just a couple, before I'm going to need to turn it back over to our Master of Ceremonies. But I'm wondering, just in like one sentence, does anyone want to drop into the chat online or just stand up and say out loud into the microphone, just like, what is one thing that you are doing to foster racial understanding? That can be, within your own home, that could be in your school, in your community, in your city, like whatever it is. But like, what's one thing that you are doing?
Or what they're going to do leaving here today.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see, we got a microphone over here.
But we have one question probably before that, but everybody should think.
Well, they can think about it.
Yeah, think about it.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Jemima Johnson, representing Rosemont College Black Student Union as
Yes.
president today.
Yes.
And my question was, in what ways can people in the millennial generation become a vehicle for the way forward and build a more sustainable form of agency to foster racial understanding? Like Professor McCarthy just said, it's hard to get young people to indoctrinate themselves. So that's the question that I'm posing to the panelists today.
We know you all might be an expert on that.
I was going to say, y'all might not necessarily think of yourselves as political, but you are absolutely multiracial, multi-gender, the coalition. I mean, you are not, the burden of kind of what has been does not seem to be as present with your generation, at least in the times that I've had a chance, especially to be in a classroom setting with college students. I've just been very encouraged by folks who are constantly showing up for each other and who understand that their fate feels very much shared, and not necessarily around their identities, but largely around a lot of issues around climate, around student debt, around what kind of economy they're going to be graduating into, right? Around what kind of healthcare they're going to have access to. Young people are thinking about this collectively, and that, for me, it feels like I see a lot of barriers being broken down among folks who are thinking about how they are going to navigate these issues as young people together, regardless of what what other identities they may or may not share.
Do you feel like that rings true based on what you've seen in your classrooms and in your social environment?
Yes, I do. To go back to your question, Ms. Adrian, about what is it that we do to create this, and create these spaces that will foster this racial understanding. I think one thing with our small community of 500 people.
Incredible.
With that being said, is that we really try to create safe spaces and get people into conversations that they feel as if they weren't invited to before. And didn't know, I think another person said, didn't know that they were even invited to these
Yes.
spaces, welcome in these spaces, or seen in these spaces.
Love that.
That's amazing.
Love that. I also heard from online from Carlisle Hicks, being my genuine self and proud of my background is one way that I am working towards this.
Amen.
So that's beautiful. Yeah, I see right over here. Give Lonnie a chance to come over. Meanwhile, go ahead and type anything else you want into the chat. Looking at those for sure.
So in answer to your other question that you asked us about what we can do. So 2020, we had a big pandemic. And we also had this George Floyd event going. And I wasn't going out to protest because of the situation. And since that time, I've asked people who protested, did anything come out of it? And they thought about it and they said, no, nothing happened. So what I did, instead of protesting, was I joined an organization, an interfaith, interracial organization that had already begun working on developing a police oversight commission for the city. I got involved with that group. And as a result, we worked with city council. We worked with other groups around the city. We worked with similar organizations around the country to push forth legislation at the city level so that we do have, to this day, a Citizens Police Oversight Commission that is going to work towards getting people in the city to oversee the police misconduct that often happens. So I say, yeah, I did something that I felt kind of good about. And the great thing about it is most of those people I've never been in the same room with. Because the good thing about the pandemic was it moved us all forward on the Zoom learning. So I can do it like in my pajamas. I don't have to go out and get dressed, and I get dressed, but I don't have to prepare and organize transportation. I can sit in my room, interface with people throughout the city, and actually move us toward getting something done. So that's my example of how we can go about doing it. And I invite everybody to seek out those types of opportunities in answer to your question as well, because I think they are there. And we have to recognize that as technology moves forward, it gives us opportunities that we didn't have before. So I'll give you, if I can, I got another example.
Very quickly though, because we're gonna have to turn it over.
Talk about what's going on in Florida with Black history. So I took it upon myself to go and read the framework that's put out by the college. And all you gotta do is download the thing and run a search on certain terms. And you can see half of the stuff they talk about isn't true. It's just not in there. I could not find the word queer, which is this big controversy over Black queer theory. I couldn't find it. So some of the things that you hear about take a little bit of time and go and research them. You don't have to go to the library like you did when I was a kid. And you can find for yourself what the truth is. Thank you.
There are a lot of threads that we can pull out of that, thinking about the role of technology, thinking about what it takes to go find information for ourselves. I think that's really important. I also am really interested in this sense of maybe the value between protest and participation in organizations. I mean, I think particularly maybe from Erin's perspective, but also from what you've seen, Jesse, that we might be able to say that there were outcomes that came from protest that took place in 2020 up to the present day. And so thinking as we do about each person doing what they can and what the particular resonance of their voice can be in the larger cacophony that leads to change, I think that might be something that's useful for us to dig into. But we can't dig into that right now, because as much as we would love for this conversation to continue on and on, we're going to have to pull it to a close. So I think it is time for me to thank our two panelists so very much, Jesse McCarthy.
Thank you.
Erin Haynes, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, everyone, for joining us in person and online. I'm going to turn it over to Lonnie to wrap things up. Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
You leave your.
Hi, I am not Lonnie, clearly. But he is my first cousin, and I hope there's a family resemblance. Okay. Our Vice President of Development, Daryl Gore, was supposed to speak right now, but Daryl can't be with us. He's under the weather. Hi, Daryl, I know you're watching. So I am pitching in because I am never without something to say, as you might have noticed. The photographs you're seeing in front of you are quite symbolic. In the year 2026, as you all know, the United States of America will celebrate our 250th anniversary. And there is a national commission called the Commission for the United States Semi-Quincentennial. Part of that, each state has their own committee. And in Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Commission for the United States Semi-Quincentennial, in parentheses, America 250 PA. And America 250 PA has decided, as part of the overall celebration, to give a commemorative bell, a replica of the bicentennial bell, which was a replica of the Liberty Bell, to 7 historic sites in the seven districts of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And to represent the northern tier of Pennsylvania, America 250 PA selected the Dennis Farm. And there you will see a rendering of the bell. And the person who let America 250 PA know about us is with us today. He's on our advisory board, and he's a friend of the farm. So George Stark, will you stand up and let everybody see you? And they selected us because they said, through the Dennis Farm, you can tell the story of the United States from the Revolution to the present. For the first time, you're doing this through a landowning African-American family. And yes, I was there in 1793. At least I'm beginning to feel that way. You will see the bell in progress. It is a 4 feet tall bronze bell, and it will be on the farm. We're dedicating it on July 28th, 2023. And then they'll be giving the other bells throughout the next 3 years. But we are the first site to receive the bell, and we are very excited about it. Now, the next slide, please. Now I ask for money. The Dennis Farm received a matching grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to turn the Dennis Farmhouse, which is how it used to look. And I'm one of the few people left who remembers when it looked like that and actually slept in that house. And they would put me in bed with my great grandmother. And it was a beautiful house. It's not so beautiful right now. You can see we have what is called a pole barn built over it to keep it from falling apart. But anyway, we are raising money to transform the farmhouse to a museum. We donated about 30 artifacts to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Actually, they came up. I had the objects at my place here in Philadelphia. They selected what they wanted, but we have a lot left. So the ones we have will be in the museum. We will also have maps that show how our family came from New England down from Pennsylvania. We have a lot, we have photographs. We have many of the books that didn't go to the Smithsonian, 19th century books. They were a literate family. Thinking of the Fugitive Slave Act, the year they purchased land was the same year of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, when people could be paid for kidnapping free Black people and taking them south. And whenever I feel discouraged about what is going on in the country today, I think of my ancestors up there on that farm in a county where Black people were only 0.5% of the population. And they survived and endured and thrived and passed it down to us. So if they can deal with that, we can work together to bring people together and prevail in this day and time. But if you all want to be a part of history, I'm looking at Lonnie the Fourth. You are going to be a part of this history, young man. If you want to be a part of history, you can contribute to our museum, or you can make a general donation to the farm. I also invite all of you to come up and see it. It's 153 acres and it's beautiful. And it will, Zian has been there. Adrian has been there. It will touch your heart. Many of you here have been there. So we invite you to come. We invite you to donate. And by all means, come and see the bell. Thank you. And I'm going to turn this back over to Lonnie.
Brian has been demonstrating his muscle strength on a regular occasion. We've worked him out thoroughly. Did everyone enjoy themselves today? Please, another round of applause for our panelists, Aaron Hayes, Jesse McCarthy, and our moderator, Adrian Whaley. Thank you to the Museum of the American Revolution for hosting this event, and to the caterer Brule. Hopefully you enjoyed your lunches, everyone. Thanks to all the attendees and our live stream audience. We really appreciate you. Please remember to complete your surveys. If you're a high school or college student, please submit your video contest entry to be eligible for the first, second, and third place cash awards. The winners will be announced the week of March 13th. And just by show of hands, for anyone who would like to tour the museum, especially to see the James Fortin Black Founders exhibition, please identify yourselves quickly, and you'll be able to meet a representative in the back of the museum following my final comments here. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. So in closing, I spent 10 years coaching Little League football and basketball. One of the great takeaways from sports is that it brings people together, regardless of their religion or their race or personal beliefs. My three children, Lonnie, Lane, and Fleur-Jetty, were active participants throughout their childhood. Lonnie with baseball, basketball, and he's still with football today. Lane with softball and cheerleading, and then my daughter Florgetti with cheerleading and track. As a football coach, one of the chants that we used to use before we took the field, I know my son is probably going to make a little fun of me after this, but that's okay, is that the coach would say, all, and then the players would respond by saying, out. The message behind it was that to give your best version of yourself and to work collectively to achieve a common goal. And for these 2 hours, we were all as one. A lot of us today escape into the reality of sports and look at it as the great unifier, if only for a brief period of time. Philly sports is a great example of that. If any of you are Philly sports fans, you know what I mean. I've always said the way I envision fostering racial understanding, was interesting to hear some of the comments here today. But the way I envision fostering racial understanding is by having a better understanding and a respect of our history, being an advocate of change for the better by trying to be the best version of ourselves as God has created us to be, taking time to appreciate what makes us different, and then respecting one another for our differences. I know it's simply stated and not always easily achieved, speaking from my own personal experience. But maybe you'll have the opportunity to make a difference to someone you came across by your actions, who will appreciate your unique quality and gain a greater respect for your history and culture and what the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust and this museum represents. And then feel inspired to do the same, and that is to give the best version of themselves in their daily walk. So when I say all, you say out. All. So I thank you again for joining this forum. Safe travels, everyone, and God bless.